Yeah, hello everybody. Uh, Global economics and yeah, right now many interesting things which will have an impact on global economics happen right now. And I also want to recommend, if you don't already know it, that I have invited two guys to give a external talk at our university. The first is Christopher Zuber. He is a member of the scientific staff of the Council of Economic Advisors, as I was in 2008, 2009. Yeah, and he will give an overview of the annual report of the Council of Economic Advisors, and it will be in English. And we will meet in our large lecture hall next Tuesday. And it would be very nice if you have time that you pass by in presence. Well, he will give the talk from Wiesbaden via Zoom, but it would be very nice to have some guys within the lecture hall. Yeah, I think this will be very interesting because this is something like you do for your country in a shorter way. This annual report is just a description of the economic situation of Germany, and of course, this report is about some 100 pages. And the other one is a guy from the Bundesbank, and he will in general talk about monetary policy, interest rates, and inflation. Well, and of course, this is a view on monetary policy in Europe. So, from the perspective of the Bundesbank on the monetary policy of the European Central Bank. And actually, this is a good point to switch to the topics we are talking about, because right now we are talking in more detail about monetary policy and especially about the monetary policy of the large central banks in the world. And yeah, there it will be also very interesting what happens in the United States, because the new government, which will be in charge in January, then they already, yeah, gave the signal that maybe in the United States there is a change, especially in the question of independence of the central banks, which we have right now in the United States and especially in Europe, where we even have this independency due to the fact that in Europe we have a so-called supranational institution, because many countries, France, Germany, Italy, and so on, we delegated our monetary policy to a supranational institution, which makes independently from the government monetary policy for the whole Eurozone. Well, and for this, we talked about the so-called reaction function, so that we assume that a central bank has specific aims, and due to these aims, this central bank is reacting. And there we learned that there is a very easy, a very simple reaction function, which just states that the main monetary policy instrument, the interest rate, is just a linear dependence on inflation and on output. And in the 1980s, in the 1990s, it was quite astonishing that with such a simple rule, one could more or less fit directly the reaction of the Federal Reserve depending on the development of inflation and output, given some inflation target and some output target. In addition, with the weights, how large is the weight of the output target and the inflation target? And well, it came out that the more or less best fit said that the weight of both targets is just around 50%. Well, although this was quite surprising, it also didn't mean that we have to change due to this just empirical fact our look on our empirical on our theoretical models, because of course this rule has of course the same dependencies which we have beforehand laid down in our theoretical models. So of course here also we have the positive dependence between interest rates and output. So the same dependence as we have it in the so-called LM rule, which we derived from the money market equilibrium in the ISLM rule. So just interchanging the LM curve with the Taylor rule doesn't change the quality or the qualitative dependencies within our old model, the ISLM model. Well, then we went through all this, that nothing qualitatively changed, but that we then could discuss with this reaction function that there are differences if, of course, these, oops, where we have it here, if we change these weights here. And that then we could discuss the situation where we more or less look only at inflation. And this then seems, on the other hand, of course, that not on the other hand, this just means that we are strictly looking only at our inflation target. And during the last decades, especially the Bank of England and the Swedish, the Svenska Riksbanken, they were, let's say, until the financial crisis, these two central banks were more or less only inflation targeter. And then on the other hand, we can switch everything and choose a very high weight on the output target. And then we would be just an output targeter. And yeah, well, if we take the new administration in the United States, then it could be the case that the Fed is forced to shift their weights in the direction of output targeting. On the other hand, this crazy guy which is going in the Oval Office, well, it is possible that every day he changes his mind and saying something else. Well, and then what else did we have? We just also discussed the situation between between uh, the financial crisis and Corona crisis, and that within this time where we hit it, the so-called nominal zero lower bound for nominal interest rates, which then meant that within these situation we have a horizontal Taylor rule because we cannot drop the nominal interest rate more than to 0%, that in this case, this has a very surprising implication that then the aggregated demand curve derived from the intersections of the Taylor rule and the IS curve, that due to this horizontal behavior, we obtain a backbending aggregate demand curve. And that such a backbending aggregate demand curve is, in describing our economy, not very nice, because this backbending aggregate demand curve exhibits the property that if we have decreasing inflation expectations, or even we have deflation expectations, that then this starts a downward spiral, so to speak, a self-fulfilling prophecy, that over time we always think of, well, deflation or expected deflation has the result of decreasing demand. Decreasing demand also pushes the deflation expectations, and that overall our economy is in the very bad situation that we somehow have to break these downward cycle. So to come back to inflation, substantially high inflation expectations, in order to get on a so-called normal growth path again. And yeah, that more or less, I think we have the guy who has Japan today in the meeting, that in such a situation, more or less, we had Japan, not only since the financial crisis, but starting at the Asian crisis in the end of the 1990s. And that this argumentation is also a reason why, especially in Europe, by following the financial crisis, then the euro crisis, that especially the European Central Bank really tried to get up again inflation, and especially inflation expectations, because we have the fear that also Europe or the Eurozone could start such a downturn cycle. Well, right now, and this is maybe the funny thing, we we are a little bit still in the situation that we do not care that much, especially in Europe, about low inflation rates or deflation, but we care about high inflation rates, especially also due to the reason of the energy crisis then started with the war in Ukraine. Okay, but then we discussed in general monetary policy rules. We have talked about the very simple rule, the Taylor rule. And now we want to discuss the so-called optimal rules, where we do not just set, well, this is the dependence of interest rates on inflation and output, but that in general we create a so-called overall function where we have our aims and that then we want to optimize our aim. And well, in our case, it will be not that complicated, but in general, if you feed in such an optimal rule, uh, an overall theoretical model of the whole economy, then I think you can really think of that it will be quite complicated. And also then you have to feed your model with real data. And since already economic data is very volatile, then of course the outcome of such rules will be also very volatile. And we have to ask how can we really use the outcome, because maybe it is not very predictable, or the spread of the outcome is also very volatile. You have a really large interval where you say the interest rates will be tomorrow, because of that, it is still very interesting to just look at the Taylor rule. And I think I have shown you here. This is the annual report. Where was it? No, here not. Did I show you the from the Fed of St. Louis, the Taylor estimation? This was, I think, here. No, I don't want. Information Fed St. Louis. What is this? This one? Have I shown it?
Yes, I think so.
Okay, good. So we don't have to. And here you really can, yeah, just play around also with different weights. And I think this is quite nice to get a feeling how this rule then works. Okay, but now we want to come to one of these optimal rules. Where did I have it? Oops, here. Looking at such an optimal rule and calculating the outcome of such an optimal rule. And this is a very famous analysis, because there we have also the problem which we find quite often in economics of time inconsistency. And here it is then in particular the problem of time inconsistency of monetary policy. And within this problem, which we will analyze today, there we then can also discuss what I have already mentioned, that in general, in a democracy, market-based society, in general, we find an institution of the central bank, and that this central bank is independent of the government in general. And well, for this, of course, we also need a reason. And one reason can be derived here from the problem which we find if we start with a um, with a function where we find the aims of the central bank, and then what happens within the process, then setting interest rates or um, uh, pushing or uh, deepening inflation. And if you want to read in more detail, then you can click on here. These are the sources where you find these time inconsistency problem. Especially, this is then called the so-called Barrow-Gordon model, but also some years before Kitland and Prescott. Prescott, I think, yes, Prescott is a Nobel laureate, and Kitland maybe also. And I won't be very surprised if in some years, maybe due to his lifetime work, so to speak, that maybe Barrow Gordon will also obtain the Nobel Prize. So very famous economists, which you find here. So, but let's go to the loss function of the central bank. And there, what we very often do is, and this you can compare uh, with the statistics and what we have when we have talked about linear regression. What did we do when we said we have a data set, and if we want to fit the so-called best line through these data points, then I'm motivated in the statistics part of this lecture that we want to minimize the sum of all squared deviations from our hypothetical line. Well, and something very similar we also now do for the central bank. Similar to our Taylor rule, we also think, well, a central bank should have mainly two aims. One aim should be the deviation from its inflation target, and the other one should be an output aim. And then the central bank should always react when the overall economy develops differently to the chosen aims. And how should we weight these deviations? Well, here we are doing the same as in statistics. Compare to statistics, linear regression. That we model our loss function just with the sum of the quadratic deviations from our target. So here it would be then pi minus pi star squared, and output we choose y minus ky star while k is larger than 1. And well, this of course also we have to modify. Why do we choose a larger aim than this would be potential output? Larger than potential output. And the reason for this is that especially in the overall economy, looking at the main production factor, and the main production factor is labor, that within the labor market, well, we cannot model the labor market as fully competitive, a fully competitive functioning market, because within the labor market we always have some wage rigidities. This means that wages do not directly react if something happens to labor demand or labor supply. We always have some time shift that the labor market is following behind the real economy. So maybe you have also found this when you have looked at your countries, doing your country analysis, that somehow you have seen that if you have a downturn in the real economy, that the labor market does not react directly, simultaneously, but that you have there a shift of 3 or 6 months in behind. And also, if the economy in the business cycle is going up again, that also the labor market is not jumping up directly when we have a we have the turning point of the real economy, that again the labor market is is behind 1 or 2 quarters. And for this, we can motivate that it would be a good choice to have in the aim some kind of overshooting. That we do not say, let's say for Germany, we have a potential output growth rate of 1.5%, that then in order to achieve these 1.5% within your aim, you choose 1.7 or 1.8 percent for the potential growth rate. So then we have these two parts, and the loss function would be then just the sum of both. And here in case we also choose the same weights, or in general, we could say alpha pi minus pi star squared plus 1 minus alpha y minus k y star squared. But further on, we choose again same weights for inflation and output. So not pi alpha equals 1/2. Well, so we have now two aims, inflation and output. Well, and what is the problem if we have these two aims? What would be the general dependence between output and inflation? About this, you have to think. And then from this, writing down a loss function with a deviation, squared deviation from inflation and output, you see that you have some problem. If we have a boom, so if we have high growth rates, so a good performance of output of Y, what does this economically would mean in general? Having a booming economy. Oh, I need the chat.
Interest rates would go up as well to
Interest rates,
fight
yeah,
against it.
well, this would be then the reaction, but why would we assume that interest rates would start? What is the reason for this? Within a booming economy, this means
Because the inflation rate would get up as well.
yes, yes, of course, because in a booming economy, this would mean unemployment goes down, income is increasing. And these are all reasons that the demand curve, overall demand curve, is shifting outwards. And this would mean, in general, of course, that inflation is going up. And we have discussed this general dependence between inflation and unemployment or then output when we have discussed the Phillips curve. So having these two aims, we have the problem that achieving a good part of our output, achieving a good result for our output, that this, on the other hand, would push inflation. But controlling inflation, let's say, on this quite low inflation rates of around 2%, which we have as the aim for the European Monetary Union, that this would mean, well, we cannot really push our output. So we have here two competing aims. Two competing aims. Well, and in order to get these together, we, of course, this is just written down again, we take together um, with our loss function also this dependence between output and inflation via the Phillips curve. Remember, Phillips curve in general was the dependence between output and between unemployment and output, negative dependence, but of course, unemployment also is negatively correlated to output. So from the Phillips curve in general, then we obtain this positive dependence between output and inflation. So, and what we now, of course, want to do is that minimizing minimizing L subject to the Phillips curve. And this we want to do right now. And also, well, we have to keep in mind that there is not only the central bank alone, but that we have also the inflation expectations of the public. In order to analyze now this process, what happens given the Phillips curve and inflation expectations of the public, what is then the central bank doing? For this, we have to make some assumptions. How do we model our inflation expectations of the public? And for this, we want to discuss some different cases. So again, we want a little bit to simplify our model. So in our case, we do not choose a 2% inflation target, but just 0. This does not change qualitatively the result of our calculations, but then we have one parameter less within our calculation, and the calculations would be then a little bit easier. Well, we can do our calculations with 3 different methods. You hopefully have seen within your studies. Actually, I think you have all these possibilities to do the calculation in my course in macroeconomics, but you should have seen this also in mathematics, microeconomics, and maybe also um, investment and in an investment lecture, maybe. So the first one, and this we will choose today, maybe afterwards we have also time for the other ones, would be just here we have a function depending on two variables, pi and oops, pi and y. So, and we have our restriction, the Phillips curve, and then we can just feed in the Phillips curve within our loss function. And what we then obtain is that we have L of pi and then y of pi. So overall, we have only a function depending then only in general only on one variable, and in order to optimize a function with one variable then just means that we have to take the first derivative, setting this to 0. Or what we can do is, since we want to optimize, we can, so to speak, calculate the general derivative of a multidimensional function. And this means to take the total differential. Compare this, we have done this when I gave you the theoretical description of the ISLM model, there I also showed you that in general, we just assume that all parameters can simultaneously vary, and therefore we have to calculate the simultaneous variation, and this is done via the total differential. So here, compare what we have done by the ISLM model. Well, and of course, here we have a problem of a loss function depending on two variables, and we have a restriction where within this restriction we find also a dependence between our two independent variables, y and pi. Well, and where within your lectures you have already seen such a problem, giving the aim depending on two variables and having a restriction where you have a dependence between your two variables. And this is called by the name of a famous French mathematician in the 18th or 19th or beginning of, I think in the beginning of the 19th century. Let's see. Where is it? Louis Lagrange. Wikipedia. So I was right. Born in the 18th and dying, died in the 19th century. So where do you have used this Lagrange method?
In micro.
In micro, yes. So this you can just compare with your aim is utility of x1, x2 subject to m p1 x1 plus p2 x2. Well, and now our x1 is pi, our x2 is y, and here we have a linear restriction, and this budget line is also just a linear restriction. So if you would choose, and maybe you have done this for utility function, just for example x1 squared plus x2 squared, then your micro example would even be just interchanging the names of the variables, the letters would be 100% the same calculation which you have to do. But now here in this case it is a little bit more complicated. Oh, here I need to see. Let's see. Because we have in our case also this part here, the expected inflation of the public. And there we have to make an assumption. How is the public reacting on an announcement of the central bank? Because what we also think is that everybody knows the aim of the central bank. In our case, we have chosen the central bank has the aim zero inflation. Well, everybody in the European Monetary Union knows the inflation aim of the ECB is 2%. So this is known. And then we can think of a situation because no one is forced to do something. So the public is free to choose what they want to believe, and the central bank is free to set afterwards interest rates, because we think that we more or less can steer, not interest rates, we setting inflation, we more or less assume that the central bank can steer inflation via setting interest rates. So this is what we think of. And therefore, at first, we just can say, and then we do not have to calculate very much. We can say, well, everybody is knowing that the central bank has an aim of 0% inflation rate. So this is announced. Then, in the first case, we think the public believes this announcement. So we take pi e also equal to 0. And then in the end, we also assume that the central bank is really implementing its announcement. And there we will find that there we have a general problem, because if we look at the loss function, when the public believes 0% interest rate, then the central bank has an incentive to deviate from setting pi to 0. But we will, at a first step, just then implementing these 0 inflation rate. The next one is that we assume, and this we call deception, that we see that more or less the public is believing the announced 0 inflation rate, but that then the central bank takes its incentive to deviate from these setting inflation rate to 0. And this, of course, then would shift our losses. And the third case, and this is then the so-called time inconsistency problem. That the central bank makes the announcement of 0 inflation rates, but the public, they know that the central bank do not implement in the end, or is not forced to implement in the end, their announcement. So they are expecting that they are deviating. But this also knows the central bank, that the public so rationally assume, well, I will deviate, and that this even pushes additionally the inflation outward because this reaction of the public is also feeding in the optimization process of the central bank. Well, now I have hopefully I could hopefully a little bit motivate what is happening within these problem, and this we will solve now formally. And in the end, we can then show that in the commitment case, the losses will be the lowest compared to this should be not commitment, transparent. Therefore, this is not good. That, yeah, that in the first case, we would have the lowest losses, but the C, I think I have to choose other letters in order to write them. So this would be commitment, T. C would be deception, and D would be discretionary. So that in the end, if everybody knows what the other one is doing, and this is feeding in the optimization process, we have, so to speak, a bad outcome. We will have the highest losses. Yeah, but 15 minutes left, so let's start the calculation. So we have L equals 1/2 a pi squared plus y minus k y star squared. And Phillips curve y, oh, again it's frozen. I don't know why it's always doing this. You still hear me, yeah? So no picture anymore or video, but you still hear me. So y equals, and I had y star plus b times pi minus expected inflation. So now we are feeding in this here. So 1/2 equals a pi squared plus y star. So here y star plus b pi minus pi expected minus k y star. Well, these two we can also put together. So we obtain 1/2 equals a pi squared plus b pi minus b pi e minus k minus 1 times y star. And now this is just a function of pi. This is our only variant parameter. And then we have to derive this. So first derivative of this function is what? What is pi squared, the first derivative?
2 pi.
This is only pi, and then 2 pi and 2 pi, and this 1/2 cancels, so we obtain a times pi. Here is something missing. Here, there we need a square, and here we also need a square. Sorry. So the second part is not that easy because there we have to use the so-called chain rule. So first of all, 2 in front of the bracket means this 2 cancels with this 2, but we have to write down the whole bracket. So then we obtain plus, opening the bracket, b pi minus b pi e minus k minus 1 y star. And what else do we need? We have the inner derivative. We have this small b in front of pi, and b times pi, what is the derivative? We have a function f of pi equals b pi. What is then the first derivative? Oh, I almost cannot hear you.
Pi.
Shouldn't it be?
It should only
Probably
be,
be
yes, great.
Yeah,
So
be.
in front of the bracket, we obtain an additional b. So first derivative, in order to minimize losses, means we have to set this to 0. And now we want just to calculate how is the our inflation, our expected inflation, how is this depending on inflation itself? And therefore, we just solve this as a, a reaction for the reaction of the public. So pi e independence on pi. Well, here we have the pi e, and therefore we are multiplying this bracket, and then we obtain a times pi plus b squared times pi minus b squared p e minus k minus 1 y star equal to 0. Then we put this part on the other side, plus b squared pi e on both sides. Here we can take pi outside the bracket. So we obtain pi times a plus b squared minus k minus 1 y star equals b squared pi e, and then dividing both by b squared, and we obtain pi e of pi equals pi times a plus b squared over b squared minus k minus 1 times y star. Be careful that I do not miscalculate, plus over b squared. And now, in this discretionary case, we can set inflation expectations to the inflation itself, because we think, due to the rationality of the public, they know the inflation aim, they know the loss function of the central bank. They rationally expect that the central bank will deviate from their announcement. And therefore, with rational expectations of the public, we obtain pi e equals pi, and setting pi e equals pi, we obtain then, now have I something miscalculated? This is okay. Y star. No, it's okay. So then pi equals pi times a plus b squared over b squared minus k minus 1 b squared y star. Now multiplying by b squared is b squared pi plus a pi plus b squared pi minus k minus 1 y star, and this cancels, and we end up overall with setting pi optimal would be a over k minus 1 y star, and this would be larger than 0 due to k larger than 1. Remember, we have chosen k is larger than 1 since we assume these rigidities, especially in the labor market. So then in the discretionary case, the central bank has an incentive to choose positive inflation, although its aim is pi star equals 0. Well, and the qualitative reason for this is just the dependence of our Phillips curve. So to speak, I'm announcing pi 0. This announcement is in the public. And then I, so to speak, surprise the public by setting a higher inflation rate. And a higher inflation rate, if this is larger than 0 in my Phillips curve, then I see I obtain a positive push on output. So with this surprise, I can push the economy, and this is an incentive to deviate from my first aim of 0 inflation rate. And then in our problem, we also assume that the public knows that the central bank has this incentive. And if they anticipate it, this even more pushes inflation outward. And if you go back in your studies, do you remember some other cases where you also have the problem that if both agents acting rationally, that then the overall outcome in the problem is worse for both agents? I think you have talked about this in microeconomics too. So here, overall outcome for public and central bank is worse than setting just inflation to zero. Although both are acting rational.
Oh, I could only think about the game theory, to be
Yeah,
honest.
yeah, great. And
Right.
what kind of problem in game theory?
A prisoner's dilemma, I would
Yes,
say.
yes. This is I don't think that after all my calculations you directly have seen that this is a prisoner's dilemma, but conceptually this is one-to-one a prisoner's dilemma, and especially here this is a reaction function where you just have these, so to speak, bad incentives that you have an Pareto inferior outcome. So if both would commit to, well, we know that your aim is zero. I believe that you will do zero and I'm doing zero. Then the overall outcome for everybody would be better compared to this situation when we feed in our optimization and our rational expectations. And this is one-to-one the same as the argumentation within the prisoner's dilemma. And you have it also, I don't know, have you talked also about oligopole theory, the so-called Cournot game?
Yes.
Yes, and the Cournot game is also just a prisoner's dilemma. So you find it quite often. Yeah, it took me a bit longer today, so we will talk in the next lecture also a little bit about this, and then for the last topic, we will talk a little bit about growth theory in general. On Wednesday, we have the career day at our university, and I have to give a little talk at the career day in the morning, and therefore on Wednesday we don't have a lecture.
On what topic? Do you have to do a talk?
I just talk about um, another possibility to study about
Ah, okay.
health and social policy for some
Mhm.
interesting students there. So no
No,
specific macro or something,
okay,
some kind
okay.
of this. Okay?
That's sad. But if we look at the from the Japanese perspective, this
Yeah,
would be a prisoner's dilemma because it was
yeah,
accurate.
yeah, yeah, for sure, for sure.
Uh, all right, thanks.
Okay, yeah. So then see you next week on Monday.
All right, bye.
Thank you.